finally acknowledging and doing something about homelessness and about the shared equity scheme. So they're the two things that people will see first in July, Tynwald. So in July, I already announced that we've provided from Treasury a grant of £118,000 to GRI to let them run their existing homelessness shelter for another 12 months, and we've got a team in place to actually to introduce to the Isle of Man the housing first concept and supported living as people get back to a better place once they're in once they've gone through the tragedy of being homeless. And in terms of the other issue for July, the shared equity scheme became completely inappropriate. The thresholds, the terms were completely out of line with markets and needs, and so therefore, fair play to the Department of Infrastructure, they've actually reviewed those, and I expect very shortly to see on the Tynwald Register the new order, which will put in place a new scheme for shared equity that will help more people to make their first steps into owning a home by creating a rent to buy sort of environment where they can save for their deposit.
What do you say to the naysayers concerning homelessness, the people who say it's somebody's fault for becoming homeless? I mean, do you moralise about all that? Do you get involved in that, or are you involved in the practicalities?
Practicalities. That there will be people who've done things that they would say subsequently contributed to their own situation, but mostly it's accidents that happen, whether it be to do with addiction or family breakups or some other tragedy that can befall anybody at any time.
So £118,000 to GRI, is that an annual grant or a one-off?
No, it's a one-off. So as we go towards a housing first approach and supported living, what we want to do is to have a network of provision for different types of people in different crisis situations in sort of homes of 3 or 4 people. It really isn't satisfactory in the long term to be pulling beds out at the end of the day and rolling them up again at the end of the day and having some sort of support during the day. We want more of a structured support to help people turn their lives around. GRI's done a wonderful job. It will work with Housing Matters, the Salvation Army, all the other charities that bid successfully to be involved in this project, but we want to move to a better situation where we have a whole housing first approach rather than an emergency housing in the basement of a church, basically.
Chris Thomas, MHK. And if you want to get in touch with Chris, text, email or call. Lots of texts coming in. Every estate that Dan Dower has built since 2010, at least 50% are rented out for investors. Surely legislation should be brought in that a first-time buyer house must be resold to a first-time buyer. Well, that's an opinion. That's texter 488. So, I mean, how do you feel about housing estates flying up and houses going to investors?
Well, the other thing that we've started and we hope to really commence with actually doing the analysis is an objective assessment of housing need. And at first sight, it does look like on the typical new housing estate, the wrong type of houses are being built to an extent. They're built in the interests of the developer to some extent rather than the interests of people on the Isle of Man who actually need housing at the moment. We'll know more about that when we've applied the standard objective assessment of housing need approach to it. What can you do about renting to buy to let? It's much more complicated when you look into it than it first seems. So, for instance, it's about who banks choose to lend to, and the Isle of Man hasn't got a tradition of interfering in private commercial decisions like bank lending. Wouldn't it be very easy to get round that sort of process, to get behind the sort of corporate veils and family arrangements and other sorts of arrangements? So it's much more complicated. This year we're analysing whether we've really got the problem in that sense, and essentially what we're doing with things like the Nurses' Home project, where we're working with Manx Development Corporation to create a new type of property, working to change the shared equity scheme, thinking about building on what's called the Colby pilot for affordable living, to actually begin to create opportunities for people to get their own homes and to rent their own homes rather than
what was
encouraging.
The Colby pilot?
The Colby pilot of 5 houses that were built by another developer in Colby, and essentially you can go in there if you don't meet the terms for social housing, but you're not as yet able to put down a deposit. We've only got 5 of those houses. Wouldn't it be great if we had a 50 in a reasonable time period? Some more in Colby, but also some in other places where people want to live, like Douglas and Onken and Ramsey and Peel, Castletown, the Ports, and so on.
You can't force commercial developers to develop a social conscience. So people will say, they see housing estates flying up, as you say, perhaps the wrong type of housing for people who currently are struggling to get on the ladder. So where does government fit in? I mean, government can intervene in the market, surely.
It can, and it can do that by establishing things like Manx Development Corporation and a housing association, and helping people with schemes to get onto the housing letter, or improving standards in terms of rental. But what's also it can do is it can plan properly, and that's what an objective assessment of housing need does. We're not responsible for planning in the Housing and Communities Board, but we can certainly contribute to it. And for instance, at the moment there's a 25% obligation on providing social housing. We're looking at the definition of affordable housing.
And also, when does that come in? Is that at the end of the development,
exactly.
or is it at the start?
So it tends to be that's the last thing that the developers built. Wouldn't it be great if somehow the planning conditions could be changed, whereby that became one of the first things that was built, especially if the Chief Minister wants to address a housing crisis. Recently, Dr. Allenson made a statement in respect to the Port Erin Marine Lab that wasn't the sort of development that was suitable for affordable housing. Effectively, just getting something done was the right thing for that site, rather than making them either have an obligation of providing affordable housing or having what's called a commuted sum because they don't provide affordable housing. If that catches on, before soon, Treasury and Department of Infrastructure will run out of money to create affordable housing units. So we've got to be very careful that we make sure that planning is remembered, and we don't cause next year's problem as we're trying to solve this year's problem.
Okay, Howard, you're live with Chris Thomas, MHK.
Good morning, Andy. Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas.
Good afternoon,
just a
Howard.
question of just catching up on a remark you just made a few minutes ago, that first-time buyers' houses should be going to first-time buyer houses. What checks, whether there are or there aren't, on people who are purchasing these, that they're, and I hate the word, downsizing? And I know of several people who have already owned or did own property and moved into a smaller dwelling because the one they had was too big. And the smaller dwellings were intended for first-time buyers. Now this, it's a terrible way of doing it, because they are depriving people of the lower rungs of the ladder to move in, yet they're cashing in by selling their bigger house and having a profit on that. Also, as you just mentioned there before, that it was Andy, I think, that some of the larger estates, and there's quite a lot of them in the various parts of the island, and they've been sold to investors, which again takes the stock away from the people that's hoping to be able to buy them as their home, not as an investment.
No, it's two very good points you make there, Howard, if I can be so bold to use your first name. Basically, downsizing can be an issue, but I don't think it's politicians' job to micromanage in that sense. And downsizing can actually be an opportunity. Wouldn't it be great if there were people who were on the point of families, or already had families, who could take the opportunity to move into the bigger houses at a different, because they're at a different stage of life compared to the people who are downsizing. For instance, in social housing, there does seem to be a potential that quite a few social houses will become available in coming years, because unfortunately we all get older, and there's quite an old population in our social housing at the moment, and so the number of the waiting list could actually reduce naturally, I guess. So there's all sorts of issues that need to be addressed, and the objective assessment of housing need does exactly that. How many people are looking for flats? How many people are looking for fewer bedrooms, more bedrooms? How many people want private houses or social houses, or in between rent-to-buy type arrangements? And that's exactly what the objective assessment of housing need is all about. It's much more helpful, in fact, than the way we've done planning in the past.
Yeah, but you referred to as social housing. People in social housing, if they want to move out of the social housing, and somebody that has a large dwelling that wants a private dwelling, I'm talking about, a larger private dwelling, and takes the smaller first-time buyer new build, then that is depriving the market of a avenue for the people to come out of social housing into private dwellings. And the other ones then are moving upstream, the larger ones. Somebody's going to move upstream, but not necessarily from a smaller dwelling, even a first-time buyer.
I think we agree, Howard. So if that is the case, we need more smaller dwellings to deal with it. We don't need to get into banning that sort of arrangement. Certainly we can work with the lenders when we have a work stream to do with that. Certainly we can use planning to try and target that sort of situation. But I don't think any politician should say we should get into micromanaging people's housing choices. We just want to create the environment and structures and the financial incentives and the financial penalties to encourage everybody to have a place that they can afford and they want to live in. That's why the Chief Minister's ambition was so great. Some people just couldn't believe what he said in his Chief Minister's manifesto, because he does talk about homes for all, and that's quite an ambitious objective to have, and he has set that down for this government, and I hope with the board to be able to work to help him deliver that.
Yeah, I know you won't be able to put a precise, but of the newer houses that are being built, how many are being used as a private, well, not a private dwelling, but subsidised in a rent, which they're being charged by the Manx government? There are a lot of properties up around Cronkaberry who are accommodating people who are on benefits, and the rent is being paid. Now, that is quite a lucrative income for the people that are building these houses.
Well, we're beginning to know more. So, for instance, the census results are now published, and what happened between 2016 and 2021 is the number of private rented properties in the Isle of Man went up by 2%, from 16% to 18%, it went up from 16 to 18%. The number of houses that were owner-occupied by people who didn't have a mortgage, and my hypothesis that is likely to be more older people, went up substantially, and the number of owner-occupied houses with people with a mortgage went down quite significantly. And I think that's just a description of the fact that younger people can't get into the housing market. The law can be changed to enable Statistics Office to get into businesses that are that have rental as their business. We might do that, but ultimately, I think we all have a feel that there are too many houses being bought for to let, and not enough to help people set up homes. So I don't think we necessarily need to wait to the statistics. We just need to do things to actually try and encourage the market to develop, so that we have the right number of houses to match the demand that residents have in the island.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Well,
thanks very much for the call.
As I say, might need a careful eye on the number that the DHS or the government is subsidising with rent.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Howard.
Take care. Bye now.
All right. Now, David's with us on Mannin Line. Hi, David. You're live with Chris Thomas, MHK.
Hi, Randy. Hi, Chris.
Morning.
I used to live in the UK, and about 50 years ago, my father bought his first house, which was a council house or social house, through the Right to Buy scheme. And I'm just wondering why that after 50 years has not been introduced into the Isle of Man, and 100% of the money raised could then be put back into building modern, affordable social housing. Okay.
Well, Right to Buy does come up from time to time. It did back in 40 years ago in the Isle of Man when it was the sort of Thatcherite policy back in the UK. It did come up again in the last administration in a few questions. I think the view in the Isle of Man has always been we've got 6,500 public sector properties. We should keep those in the public sector, and we might need to change the way that we use them rather than selling them off. So, for instance, Labour Party's policy is to build more new social houses, but so that might be necessary when we have our objective assessment of housing need. But to date, there hasn't been strong political pressure to introduce the Right to Buy system, because I think people like the idea that we have settled communities in Derby and Williston and Annika and Pulrose and down in Janet's Corner and the like. We don't have some of them that have been sold and some of them that just never got sold and become. Some people even use the word sort of sink estate type places because nobody would buy them. So I think. I certainly agree with you that policy has been around as an option. It has been considered in the Isle of Man, but I don't think anybody's pushing us to consider that at the moment.
Do you think it's a good idea, David?
I do, because if you've lived in a house for a while and you get a good discount on the sale of the property, you then more likely to want to put a new bathroom, a new kitchen, get an electrician in, paint the house, look after the garden. You're then generating money back into the economy for all various trades. It'll just boost the economy enormously. Chris, how many houses did you say was on the social list?
6,500 public properties, including sheltered and all of the different people who run it.
Right, okay. I worked for a housing association across, and they were in charge of 14,000 houses.
Yeah.
And it was all done through one office, a central office. So it could, obviously, why can't that be done over here? Just do it through one central office and cut down on all the double and treble and quadrupling of jobs.
Yeah. The Civica housing management system has been introduced, and that's standard housing association type property management for tenancies and maintenance and the like. I think policy has been for about nearly 10 years now to encourage shared lists in the regions of the Isle of Man. So I think we are moving to try and optimise and rationalise the organisation, because exactly as you say, even if all 6,500 in the Isle of Man properties were run by the same person, it would still be a tiny UK operation, and there must be economies of scale. But ultimately in the island, though, we do have a big mountain in the middle of the island, and people in the north and people in the south do feel different from people in Central Valley, and sometimes even the Westerners, absolutely insist that they need everything for themselves. So
where are we with the housing association on the island?
It's Tynwald policy to establish one, and when we come to, this year, when we look to see how we'll deal with homelessness, for instance, to me it would make a lot of sense to have a housing association deciding whether you're homeless to get into the housing home, rather than putting it down to Peel Town commissioners and all the other bodies. I think they agree. And secondly, when it comes to key workers and helping people get their first homes, wouldn't that be better if that could be centralised? At this stage, I'm not going to say, like Chris Robertshaw did 7 or 8, even perhaps 10 years ago now, that we absolutely need regional associations. That decision hasn't been made. We certainly need to optimise the way we organise for it, but I do think a housing association can start in embryonic form and can do whatever is necessary and suits. Back to your right to buy idea, I'm not dismissing the idea that there might be some sales that are useful. So Douglas Borough Council, for instance, had sold some houses in places that didn't make sense for there to be public sector housing. Selective sales is a good idea, but constantly when we're running public policy, we've got to make the choice between helping one person, because as you said, somebody who bought their council flat in the UK made a fortune in the early days of Mrs. Thatcher. We've got to make sure that we're not spending too much money on a few individual people, and we're actually using the public sector stock for everybody. I think that's what it comes down to.
Okay, David, what were the hurdles to getting a place in your housing association? What did you have to qualify as?
You just have to go onto the list.
Yeah.
Whether you were a single person, a single parent, individual, old age pensioner, you went onto the list and you were judged accordingly. I don't know if it was on a point system or not, but just a brief word on that. If you do introduce a housing association to the Isle of Man, can you make sure that you bring somebody in who's ran a housing association and not just promote somebody from within? Because every so often you hear these stories of people making catastrophic mistakes because they've never been in that job before. And a famous saying from one of the newly elected MHKs, it's going to be a steep learning curve. Yeah. I shouldn't be paying for people to have a steep learning curve. If you're going to do a job, you've got to be qualified to do it.
Completely agreed. So just so you know, there is legislation in the Isle of Man since 1976 to establish housing associations. We have some, but they are absolutely tiny. We've got the Manx Housing Association, we've got the Manx British Legion Housing Association. We've got the odd one, Manx Housing Trust, but they're all tiny and they're very specific, and I completely agree with you. We need to have a professionally managed housing association like we've got a professionally managed development corporation now. So these are great ideas, and thanks for making them. And, my colleagues in Tynwald made some great ideas in this area as well. So Tim Johnston, for instance, talked about the same points that you make, which you'll look after your home if you know that you're going to be there for longer, and you'll pay for things if it's going to be yours for longer. And also, when you're in social housing, you should be able to save to be able to do something else at a different stage in your life if you want to. And these are definitely on our policy agenda. It's just the idea of right to buy is not actually wasn't actually suggested by any of my colleagues at the moment. If it's there, it'll come up in the next year, because we've made no decisions as yet. But I haven't sensed a huge political clamour to a social clamour to have the right to buy here.
All right, good to hear from you. Thanks for calling.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, here's Juan with us on Mannin Line. You're live with Chris Thomas. Juan?
Afternoon, Andy. Afternoon, Chris.
Afternoon, Joan. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm primarily looking at the word crisis here. I mean, that's what we're talking about is housing crisis. I mean, I've just come from Florida. I mean, everywhere's got a housing crisis, not just here. Obviously, we're noticing it more here. It's a small island, so it's in your face. People in Central Florida are getting priced out and can't afford to live, and there's a lot of homeless there. So this is an ongoing thing. The more house prices go up, it's investors want a return on their money. So obviously rents go up, and people are all in Section 8, Section 9 housing, which is assisted housing over there. And again, we're saying about crisis. Recently, the narrative coming from government to landlords has not been, its best. And you've alienated a lot of landlords and caused a lot more of a problem here for yourselves, which government were warned that this would happen, and it has happened. You've now got quite a lot of decent, good landlords who are now coming out of the market because of over-regulation and overreach by government. So if we're talking about a crisis, I think the government should be, more aligned to working with the landlords than working against them. My other point is, I noticed, in America, there's a lot of manufactured homes which are very affordable, very quick, very cheap to put up. And you made a comment there before of where people want to live. Well, if you've got a bit of a housing crisis, it shouldn't be where people want to live, it's where people can live. And if we can put up a decent kind of community of manufactured homes, which are going to be cheap to run, which you don't need foundations for, you just need services put in and roads. You could have a little bit of a crisis averted by doing that kind of thing. I have a friend at the moment who's working with the Welsh Council of putting up manufactured homes, which he's making, and I looked around him in his factory. Absolutely fantastic little pieces. Nice little pieces of kits inside, nice houses to live in, very cheap, very affordable, something that can be done, it can be stackable, it can be used in many different ways. So there is options out there, I think, that the government could reach. If we're talking about a crisis, and that's the word that's getting used here, so I'm just following down that line.
No, all very good points. And the first one that you made was that we need to work with landlords, private and public, and I completely agree. I think private landlords now believe me when I say that there isn't any work as yet going on to set the minimum standards and to bring the registration into force in the next 6 months. I think they believe me. And the first stage, I think they also believe now, will be setting up focus groups. The initial phase will be on an occupancy deposit and arbitration scheme, working out how that can be funded and how that can be worked, and then we'll go on to setting the standards in the coming years, because we need to increase the standard. That goes to the heart of one of the Manx crises, which might not exist in Florida. I don't know anything about the Floridan property market, but we have 6,000 properties that were declared vacant in the last census, and that can't be optimal. They can either be refurbished to be lived in, either as rents or owning, or they should be knocked down and replaced by where people can live. So we've got to get to the bottom of that, and that's why we've got an empty properties initiative, which is brand new, hasn't been done for 20 years. They tried it 20 years ago, but it hasn't been done, and our problem is much worse than it was 20 years ago. Moving on to your point about self-build and modular housing, all very good ideas. So, but what's the state's role in that? Presumably, it's just creating land for that sort of approach, and I think that's what we are doing with what's called the Derby Community Initiative, possibly. And I think completely take your point, which is that it all depends on planning. We would need to change planning in certain places to allow that sort of approach, and that's exactly why the Housing and Communities Board is there. We have no powers as such. We don't have budget. We have a fund to which we can apply that Treasury administers. Our staff, at the moment, we get our first full-time member of staff in July, but there's some heroes around the public service who've worked from the side of their desks, making huge progress. And I hope that all your ideas about modular construction, self-build, and approaching it like they did after the Second World War, and so on.
I was going to say, if somebody suggested the government should put up an estate of 30 prefabs, would that be wildly inappropriate?
I don't think that's going on. So the nurses' home has been, derelict for a great number of years, and now we're getting 37 flats out of it, subject to planning permission. In North Douglas, there's some exciting initiative going on about refurbishing some stuff that could be useful for key workers. And Juan's exactly right. If there is the right land where modular construction is appropriate, I'm not against it, and I would hope that the planners that the planning law would allow it.
Okay, Juan?
Yeah, I mean, going back to, Paul Rose was originally, I think, what they call them, jerry houses, and I think they were built for temporary use, and I think they've lasted, 70 or 80 years, I think they lasted in the end. Mm-hmm. And again, going back to crisis, modular manufactured homes is not the ideal situation, but you've got a 20, 30-year lifespan, so hopefully that would get you through the crisis point. And again, on the landlord sector there, and I appreciate you saying that, standards have to be kept up. We just have to be mindful that there is not an overreach of government in this. I mean, you've got quite a few standards there at the moment which should be met, and we all know there is bad landlords there. We also know, and that's the elephant in the room, there's bad tenants as well who no one really wants to put in there. And sometimes these, what we call a slum landlord, shall we say, for the want of a better word, has a place in the market because there's people there who feel that they can just wreck people's properties and get away with it.
Let's say subprime, shall we?
And the other issue, Joan, that we have to think about is that the state shouldn't be too involved in affecting the market through something like a housing association. We've got to be clear that society accepts what's the role of the private sector and what's the role of the public sector. So some people do worry at the moment that Manx Development Corporation is exceeding its reach by needing only a lower rate of return than the private sector would need for that thing. But there are others who say, look, 20 years on with all these brownfield sites and these derelict buildings, we need somebody to come in from the state to do something. So we've got to get that balance right. We need fair competition between the private sector and the public sector, certainly. We need to settle it politically and socially exactly what the role of the public sector is. And at the moment, I do think that the public sector isn't doing enough in terms of housing association, helping people find their homes. I do think the standard of some properties needs to be improved, but I completely take your point that the state shouldn't overreach itself and it can't go micromanaging every property.
Okay, all right, thanks, Stuart.
Cheers, Andy. Cheers, Chris.
Thanks, appreciate that. There's a note in from Helen. We got loads of stuff to get through, so briefly, if you would, I think the government, this is Helen, needs to urgently purchase or use the land they own and initially build a range of various size social to purchase only properties. Totally vet people, prevent investors taking properties. Owning your own home is not a realistic option for many people. I predict nothing's going to be built in the present government. The recent census revealed there was an increase in single and two-person households. So what's been done to provide suitable homes for them and to future-proof against disability, let's say? Why haven't we built on the vacant sites in and around Douglas?
No, Helen's right to be sceptical. My name is Thomas, and Thomases normally are sceptical, but I do think that there's a momentum going now, so I do think that Helen can expect the government-owned brownfield sites to be redeveloped in the next 5 years, and also that the momentum that's developed around that will actually take out some of the privately owned brownfield sites around the island as well. And Helen's exactly right. We do need more 1 and 2 bedroom houses, and that wasn't showing up. And that's what the objective assessment of housing need will conclude, I believe. I don't want to bias the analysis because it's objective analysis, but it seems like the early evidence is that we haven't got enough 1 and 2 bedroom houses, firstly. And secondly, we don't have the sort of middle of the range, so the middle properties. We have social housing and we have private housing. We don't have the rent to buy and all of those sorts of schemes that we need to have, and that's why I'm so excited by the Colby project, and I hope that we can change the law and financing to help people get on to the housing ladder, or into, if they want to rent for longer, into proper rental arrangements.
Okay, 24 minutes to 1 on Mannin Line today. The Housing and Communities Board Chair, Chris Thomas, MHK, is with us through till 1.
Rex Motor Company, or should I now say the award-winning Rex Motor Company, are here for leasing, sales and servicing of some of the best cars money can buy. We're the first motor dealer to win an Isle of Man award for excellence thanks to our excellent customer service, and you can expect that every time you come and see us. Our friendly showroom team are on Whitehoe Industrial Estate, so come and have a browse of our top-of-the-range vehicles, or visit rexmotorcompany.im and have a browse at home. That's rexmotorcompany.im.
Grill, bake, steam, boil, stir-fry, simmer, fry, roast, slow cook, griddle, toast. An Arga can do it all. An Arga isn't just an amazing cooker, it's a way of life. Arga specialist Haldane Fisher can recommend an Arga for every home. Call in store and discover the range and join thousands of owners who love coming home to Arga's warmth, style and practicality. Haldane Fisher for Arga. Home to great cooking.
You want how much? 1% commission? That's £2,000 to sell my house. That's it. I'm seeing red.
Sick of huge commission fees? Don't get mad. See red. With CG Red, the new service from Cowley Groves, you can sell any house up to £350,000 for a fixed £750 fee. That's a saving of up to £2,750 on what you'd pay with a traditional estate agent.
So go on, see red. Visit cgred.im. They're giving other estate agents a darn good thrashing.
The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
22 minutes before 1 with Chris Thomas, MHK from the Housing and Communities Board. This is from Mark, who just said, why don't they build more public sector houses with the rents from the current one? Do they have thousands in the bank? Are they running a surplus from the rents?
Yes. The DOI runs a surplus from its rents, but then it pays deficiencies to Douglas and Peel and so on, Ramsey, where they've built new estates down south as well. So we've got to get that balance right. It might well be that we need more social houses. That's not ruled out. We need an objective assessment of housing need as soon as possible, and it might mean. But as I said before, I like to think the 6,500 properties can be at social housing levels, or they can be in 21st century arrangements to create opportunities to rent or own as well as that. Another point to make is that we've got a crisis in sheltered housing and care and extra care, and talked earlier on about downsizing. Wouldn't it be great if older people could move into the right house for them at their stage of life, and free up houses for families who are at a different stage in life and have different housing requirements? We've got to look at this thing across every part of society, and we've got to treat everybody fairly, intergenerationally fairly.
Okay, David, you're live with Chris Thomas, MHK.
Yeah, good afternoon, Chris. I wanted to talk to you about the island social housing, and in particular the age of the current stock that you've got. Now, most of the social housing on the Isle of Man is rather old, and it's going to come a point where it's going to either need demolishing or renovating. Now, currently, I know there's a scheme going on down in Castletown and School Hill where you're rebuilding that estate. And there's also a major scheme going on in Douglas North and the Williston estate. Now, that scheme in Williston, I think it's probably approaching 10 years old now, and it was started off as quite a small scheme, and it's through time it's evolved into quite a major scheme. So what my point is, that, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer it because this may be a local authority matter, but the point of the fact is that when does the cut-off point actually stop? Because with each phase that they're going through, like for talking sake in Williston, the cost keeps going up and up and up. So at some point, surely there must be a cut-off point, because all that's going to happen in a rather large estate like Williston, it's just going to become a merry-go-round where you're constantly throwing money at an estate that's getting redeveloped. And perhaps the best option should have been, at the time, which was rejected by government, to demolish and rebuild. But now the costs are just spiralling out of control.
So two points, David. The first one is I completely agree with you. That rational decisions got to be made, and you've pointed out that just something carrying on for 10, 15, 20 years just because it started 10 or 15 years ago is not a good enough reason for it to carry on. So School Hill, Castle Hill in Castletown is exactly the right thing to do in that case. It was about replacing houses in an organised way, and it could be that Williston is the wrong approach in the future. Absolutely worry that there will be a local authority perspective and a government perspective, but we can't afford to have that. We need an all-island national housing policy, and we need to make the right decision for what to do in the future with Williston, but also what to do now with Lord Street flats. Derby hasn't as yet been refurbished completely, but will need to be. We need to make the right decision about Derby. So you've nailed it really. We need to actually be doing things and making decisions now for the future, regardless of decisions that have been made in the past. And fair play to DOI. They have spent 6 or 7 years doing an investment survey, and I hope that we can be flexible and we can work with Douglas and Ramsey and the other big authorities to make the right decision for our properties for the next 20 years, not carry on implementing the decisions that were made 20 years ago if they're the wrong decisions now.
Yeah, I take your points and I agree with them, but my thoughts aren't entirely, I think, I'm not sure, like I use Williston as an example of how far they actually are with that complete renovation and redevelopment. So it may be that they're 50% through. So I know from fact that the extent of refurbishment has gone from a period of, let's say, if we're talking, say, 12 weeks to now over a year, and it may run into 18 months. So that's a substantial cost to what the original phase was. But the point I'm trying to get is just because you've started doesn't mean to say you've got to finish.
Yep.
Sometimes you've got to reevaluate halfway through. And it's not about admitting defeat, because when you started that project, everything was different. We were in a much different place.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Are you going to stand for politics? Because that's the way to do it. It's really hard to get people to accept that, but we have to solve the problems that are going to be there next year and in 10 years' time and in 20 years' time, regardless of egos about what's happened in the past. Completely agree. You're so right.
Okay.
I do think Douglas.
Okay. Cheers now.
I do think Douglas and government will work together well, and I do think there's a good opportunity now to work with the other housing authorities around the island as well.
Okay, jolly good. Thanks for your point, David. And if you live in Williston, you'll know all about it. Stephen, you're live with Chris Thomas, MHK.
Good afternoon, Andy. Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas, and good afternoon, listeners.
Afternoon, Stephen.
I'd just like to make some comments, please. Firstly, I know you briefly touched upon it in your remarks before the previous caller, and it is an important aspect. We are concentrating some of our efforts on what young people can do and how we can help young people get established with even just a property. But there is a big void, I feel, at the other end of the spectrum, where you've got people both in public housing and private housing who, for all sorts of reasons, really do want to move, and there's not the ability for them to do so. And then, of course, they get criticised they get criticised for not bed blocking, but house blocking in a sense. Yeah. And I'm concerned we get this age problem being set up of people looking at older people, possibly with envious eyes at them having a big property, but not understanding that these older people want to move. And also, to add to that, how does the issue of providing affordable care for older people come in, such as those that may not need medical intervention, but just need tea and meals making for them and help to wash? So, for example, in Peel, we lost the affordable care, respite care and residential care in the Corran home last year that, for whatever reason, the DHSC wouldn't support and keep going. So there's that issue. And my final point is, how will you tie in the climate emergency to your position as chair to try and enable that we can make it easier for people who are in their older properties and try and help them to insulate and make them more environmentally acceptable? So there's three strands there.
Okay. Completely agree that if we focus on helping older people, it'll help younger people as well. So we've got to look at this in an intergenerational way. And what happened in the Corran Memorial Home was sad, if not tragic, and nothing's happened since to address it. I still remain disappointed that we didn't make more progress sooner on sorting out paying for care. And the current government policy is that will be looked at again in 2023, 24, and I'll be all over them to make sure that they look at the funding of care and the arrangement of the social care aspects. And there is a work stream in housing to make sure that we now use this objective housing assessment of housing needs to launch looking at the needs of older people with wraparound care and all of the other things that you need. Second point is we've only got a fund of £2 million we can apply to. The climate change and the economic recovery funds are huge compared to ours, and it's been estimated 40 or 50 million pounds of remedial work to do in houses. That's from the private condition housing survey. That's just in the private sector. Public sector needs a work programme, so we need to get hold of public finance where necessary to basically make sure there's a just transition for older people and younger people, all of us, as the island changes the way it heats houses and builds houses for in the light of the climate change initiatives. So as always, Stephen, you make very good points.
Okay, thanks for that, Stephen. We have to race on because Kevin's with us now to talk about, what was it, Kevin?
Hi there. Yeah, the first-time buyer houses, this problem's going to continue going on for years and years and years and generations the way we're going, where, in my eyes, it's quite simple. If someone buys a first-time buyer's house for 70% of the market value now, and they keep it for 10, 20 years, they should have a covenant on the house that has to be sold to another first-time buyer for 70% of the market value, whatever, 10 years, 20 years' time.
That's one policy option, and this year we'll be putting on the table that policy option and other policy options. Very good point. You made the point well, and that's one of the options that we have on the table.
Okay.
Surely, the only option, isn't it?
No, there would be other options. But that hasn't been the case so much in the past. But we could move. I mean, there are two schemes. One of them's got more of that characteristic. But certainly for 10 years or so, there has been a view that we can't just favour a few people. We've got to help more people, and that's what a politician's job is. It's to make balances across the whole of society. And your idea is a very good one, and it's definitely a strong possibility.
Because what people are doing is wait until the 10 years is up and then selling it for full market value, which is fine because that's the policy, but it's obviously, it's not very good for the next lot of people coming through.
Okay, all right, we appreciate that. And Luke in Douglas has got a point here, Chris Thomas. I know people that were eligible for a council house years ago when they were low earners. Years on, they're now on good wages. Sometimes the household's got a six-figure income because of the people inside it. But they still live in a council house. So will council house owners, council house tenants be means tested every 5 years or so? This will ensure that people who need the council houses get them, and to people who can afford a mortgage, get a mortgage.
The 5-year fixed term tenancies have come to their end for many people. So that question is live. Those fixed term tenancies weren't backdated. It's only if you had something done to your house significant and so on. So that's a live issue, and we've got a policy paper about this very thing at the next Housing and Communities Board. So it's an issue that we've got to agree with everybody that we're going to solve. I think the reality is in most of our socialist housing estates is that sort of person is very unusual. There are very few of them, but people talk about them more. The reality is that most of the people in social housing are older and poorer. But the Housing Income and Expenditure Survey does show that there are some fairly high income people in social houses.
Okay, with Chris Thomas, MHK, back to the phones in a moment.
You're sure to find something fabulous at Ramsey Art Gallery, jewellers and engravers.
From stunning gold and silver jewellery that you can make extra special with an engraved message to local prints and gifts for every occasion. Ramsey Art Gallery also stock a fantastic range of watches, including Ted Baker, Citizen, Storm and Accurist.
Plus Seconda, Timex, Sexy and Bolivar.
All with lifelong free strap adjustment. You'll love what you find in store when you visit Ramsey Art Gallery, jewellers and engravers, opposite the RNLI shop in Ramsey.
Every drop is precious. Water. So easy to take it for granted, isn't it? Our reservoirs supply the needs of our island, but with the effects of climate change, that's becoming more challenging every year. Manx water is the only water we have, so we need to make every drop count by using it wisely, at home, in the garden and in general. Visit manxutilities.im to find out how you can begin smarter living, to lower energy bills and reduce your impact on our island environment.
The Crossroads team are always on the lookout for any furniture you no longer need. From tables and chairs to beds and footstools, let us find your furniture a new home. Arrange free collection online at crossroadsiom.org or drop it off at our new home furnishing stores on the Millmount Complex next to Millcreasts. Visit crossroadsiom.org to find out more.
This TT, Villa Gaiety are here to entertain you with some of the best names in music and comedy. Milton Jones, ELO Experience, Craig David presents TS5, DCAC, Pigs on the Wing, and the Steve Gibbons Band. Plus the Bushies TT Village is back with live music, food, drink and a great atmosphere. Visit villagaiety.com/TT or call 600 555 for details. Villa Gaiety, the island's premier entertainment venue.
The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
And Chris Thomas. And Jed, you're live with Chris Thomas.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hello, Jed.
Question for you. Isle of Man government policy is to attract high net worth individuals who enjoy supremely advantageous tax benefits, much more than the average person in the street. Now, some of these high net worth individuals, between them, own hundreds and hundreds of houses for rentals on the Isle of Man. I'd like your opinion on whether that is a good thing, whether you agree with it, and if you don't, what would you as an individual try and do with it?
I suppose there are 2 points that you make. The first one is, do we have the right tax policy? And what I'd say is, when I was in government, we massively increased the tax take from high net worth individuals. So the tax cap went up from 125,000 to 200,000 when I served in government, and so you're now obliged to pay 200,000 pounds in tax each year as a minimum contribution if you're on the tax policy. In terms of the multiple earnings, you are right. It seems that there are some people who have that number of properties. I don't think some of the people are all actually high net worth. I think some of them are not that thing, and they still have lots of property. I would like to think that using market forces and using changing policies, that there will become an incentive for them to sell. And I have noticed recently that quite a few landlords keep complaining that they're having to actually sell up their property. And if there's a demand to purchase properties, I'd like to think that trend will continue. I don't think we're going to ever have the politics and the social aspirations in the Isle of Man to nationalise property like you had in the time of the Russian Revolution or something like that. I don't see that. So I think the way it works is to change the planning laws, to change the tax laws, but basically, rich people tend to be very, very focused on market, and I think there's a market into which to sell properties at the moment. And I think there are people who say that around Governors Hill, around Ballafton, there are quite a lot of properties that are being sold from rental into owner occupation. So I think that trend might well be continuing.
What do you think, Jed?
Well, this is the key issue. It's not about building on brownfield sites or constructions out of town and what have you. If we take control of the rental market and make it prohibitive by legislation that could be introduced, say, within a year, that could limit the amount of owners of properties. So you can't have, say, one or two individuals controlling, the market forces because they're in possession of, say, 200-300 houses. Then we could have a shortcut to success very quickly without, destroying the countryside and the environment that we love.
So 2 points, I think, Jed. There's two legal possibilities already. The first one is, if there is sort of collusion and market abuse by those people, the fair trading law would already be could already be used to address that. So if there is an artificial market and the market abuse, we could already do that without changing the legislation. And secondly, if people are charging excessive rents, I've discovered recently, and bringing it to the attention of more and more people, we already have rent control legislation from 1948. We have on the Isle of Man legislation that was repealed by Mrs Thatcher in 1980 still. And so therefore there is a possibility to actually get your rent tested against market norms. I do like to think that market forces are going in the right direction, and the policy is encouraging them in the right direction. And I don't think we actually live in a place where people will tolerate expropriation and some of those things that have gone on in other places and unfortunate moments of history.
Okay, thanks, Jed and Chris Thomas. Well, I got through about 10% of what we wanted to talk about, but it's good to talk to you, Chris. So, as we only did 10%, will you pop back later this summer?
I'd love to. Thanks very much, Andy.
What are you doing during TT? Anything special?
We'll be here by the sound of it.
Chris Thomas, MHK, Housing and Communities Board. Lots and lots and lots of texts that we didn't quite get to, but thanks for calling in today. Thanks for being part of Mannin Line. Back with an open line tomorrow, thanks to producer Barry Redfern. Stick around for 1 to 2, 1 to 3 with Christy D after the news at 1.